The first pirate fleet did not burn. It simply stopped moving. Cargo bays sealed by contracts older than their captains, accounts frozen by signatures no one remembered signing, engines starved not by blockade, but by compliance. Crews waited for gunfire that never came, listening instead to the soft chime of denied access and the suffocating silence of a universe that had decided they no longer existed. Somewhere far away, humans closed a ledger, not with anger, but with relief, and the galaxy realized too late that it had just watched a war fought without a single shot, and lost. Cold light slid across the marble plains of the Galactic Council chamber, refracted through crystal lattices that hummed with ancient power. The air smelled of ionized dust and antiseptic oils, a sterile scent meant to suggest order where none truly existed. Vast holographic trade routes pulsed overhead like arteries, and along them flickered red scars where convoys had vanished. The Council's members remained still, their forms carved from chitin, vapor, or stone, their collective silence heavier than gravity. They had learned, over centuries, that looking too closely at those scars invited discomfort, and discomfort threatened stability. The pirate clans thrived in the soundless gaps between those glowing lines. Their ships did not roar with superior engines or blaze with overwhelming firepower. They drifted in legal shadow, quiet and efficient, their hulls patched and repatched, smelling of recycled air and scorched metal. Each vessel belonged to a different registry, each crew bonded to a different flag, each contract filed in archives so old their custodians no longer remembered why they existed. When a convoy burned, the vacuum carried no screams, only the faint crackle of cooling debris, and no law could be pointed like a weapon at the perpetrators. Responsibility shattered across borders like light through broken crystal, scattering into fragments too small to grasp. To the elder species seated in the council, this was not cruelty but mathematics. Intervention demanded fleets, negotiations, and risk, while loss could be amortized and forgotten. The cost of action outweighed the value of the dead, a conclusion reached so often it had become instinct. Reports of starvation arrived wrapped in formal language, their emotional weight stripped away. Colonies adapted by dimming their lights, stretching rations thinner, teaching children to sleep through hunger and fear. The galaxy adjusted itself downward, expectations recalibrated to survive in a universe where predation was simply another constant. Humanity existed within this adjustment, small and fragile against the abyss. Their freighters bore the scuffs of near misses and the faint tang of fear soaked into recycled fabrics. Crews carried habits from lost worlds, touching worn talismans before hyperspace jumps, recording names of missing ships in personal logs that no official archive requested. They learned the routes pirates favored by the absence of stars on navigation charts, by the lingering static where distress calls had died. They felt the cold logic of the Council as keenly as vacuum against unshielded skin, and they endured it, because endurance had always been their inheritance. Above all, humanity learned to remember. Where others forgot for efficiency, humans cataloged pain, turning loss into data, grief into quiet resolve. In the endless dark between stars, as convoys burned and trade lanes bled, the Council's gaze slid away once more. Humanity did not. Ledger lights flickered in the dim holds of pirate stations, cold blue against rusted bulkheads, while the low vibration of idling reactors bled through bone and metal alike. The air tasted of recycled breath, old oil, and quiet confidence. These were not places of roaring conquest, but of murmured calculations, of data slates passed between clawed hands and scarred fingers, of patience rewarded not by glory, but by continuity. Outside the viewports, the stars drifted past in indifferent silence, and beneath that silence the pirate clans prospered. They thrived because they understood something the galaxy pretended not to see. Firepower drew attention. Territory invited retaliation. But paper, properly layered and forgotten, could conquer entire trade routes without ever firing a shot. Their fleets were modest by galactic standards, hulls mismatched, and engines tuned just well enough to escape pursuit. Yet behind every raid lay an invisible architecture of accounts and proxies. Shell corporations nested inside, holding trusts buried beneath trade guilds whose founding charters had yellowed into myth. The pirates did not steal so much as they redirected, nudging cargo and credit along channels designed to blur ownership until responsibility dissolved. After a convoy burned, insurance algorithms engaged with mechanical calm. Claims processed themselves through systems that valued speed over scrutiny. Payouts flowed, tariffs shifted, and the loss was absorbed into margins so vast they swallowed grief whole. Investigations stalled in jurisdictional labyrinths, each authority pointing elsewhere, each archive producing forms but no conclusions. The pirates vanished into that fog, their transponders clean, their manifests immaculate. In the quiet aftermath, the only evidence left behind was the smell of scorched plating and the memory of silence where a ship had once been. Entire species learned to live around this reality. Along the edges of the trade lanes, worlds dimmed their beacons and shortened their broadcasts, choosing obscurity as a form of armor. Children grew up tracing alternate routes on star charts, taught that survival meant never being the most efficient, never being the most visible. Merchants adjusted schedules by instinct, feeling for danger the way skin feels for heat. Losses became seasonal, expected, mourned briefly, and then folded into routine. Courage was reframed as recklessness, and caution elevated to virtue. In this calculus, resistance became a kind of madness. The galaxy rewarded those who bent, who adapted, who learned to look away. The pirate banners, patched with symbols that meant nothing to anyone else, drifted unchallenged through the stars. Their presence felt more than seen. They were part of the background now, like radiation or gravity, a hazard to be accounted for rather than confronted. Even the Council's distant condemnations carried no weight, words dissipating into vacuum without consequence. Humanity existed within this web, not as masters or rebels, but as participants forced to learn its contours. Their cargo ships smelled of old coffee and sterilizing agents, of sweat trapped in fabric and hope trapped in routine. Crews worked in silence broken only by the hum of life support and the soft clack of tools against hull plating. Each jump carried a private ritual, a pause to check straps, to glance at a photograph taped near a console, to breathe once before the stars stretched and twisted. When pirates struck, humans endured as others did, filing reports, claiming insurance, absorbing loss. Yet something in them refused to fully adapt. Where others taught their young to be invisible, humans taught them to remember. Names of lost ships were written in personal logs, etched into bulkheads, whispered during maintenance cycles. The pirates saw this as sentimentality, a weakness to be exploited. They mistook endurance for acceptance, grief for surrender. They did not notice the way humans lingered over paperwork, the way their eyes tracked flows of credit and cargo with a focus that bordered on obsession. Across human stations and settlements, the quiet labor continued. Accountants worked in rooms that smelled of stale air and overheated processors, their screens filled with numbers spelled out in full, each entry cross-referenced and preserved. Analysts traced routes not just of ships, but of money, mapping dependencies that spanned systems and generations. They learned which refineries always overproduced, which insurers never questioned, which guilds had forgotten their own rules. This work lacked the drama of battle, but it demanded a different kind of courage, the patience to stare into complexity without blinking. To the wider galaxy, humanity appeared small and fragile, another species learning to survive by avoiding attention. Their worlds bore the marks of loss, memorials tucked into corners where traffic flowed past without slowing. Yet beneath the surface, a different adaptation was taking place. Humans were not becoming invisible. They were becoming meticulous. They treated every theft as data, every injustice as a thread to be followed, no matter how long it took. In a universe that prized speed and decisiveness, they chose slowness and memory. The pirate clans continued their work, confident in the structures that protected them. They expanded cautiously, always careful to remain beneath thresholds that might provoke action. Their accountants celebrated clean audits and balanced books, the true measure of success. They believed the galaxy immutable, its rules fixed in their favor. Around them, species bent and adjusted, accepting the lesson that the universe rewarded caution, not courage. Humanity learned the same lesson, but drew a different conclusion. In the cold light of distant stars, among ledgers and lost reports, they began to understand that caution could also be weaponized, that patience could outlast predation. The pirate banners still drifted, unchallenged and confident, unaware that the very systems they relied upon were being watched, remembered, and quietly, inexorably, mapped by a species that had survived worse than thieves among the stars. Data chimes whispered through human trade hubs like distant rain, soft and constant, layered beneath the hiss of air recyclers and the muted thrum of docked engines cooling their cores. Screens glowed with columns of text and slow-moving graphs, their pale light reflecting off tired faces and metal walls scuffed by generations of hands. The smell was familiar and unremarkable: warm circuitry, brewed stimulants, recycled oxygen carrying the faint trace of home. Nothing about these places suggested war. Nothing about them hinted at defiance. Humanity entered the galactic equation without spectacle. Their ships slid into ports already crowded by older powers, hulls painted in conservative colors, transponders clean, paperwork immaculate. They did not chase pirate signals through dangerous corridors or announce moral outrage to the Council. They did not raise banners or issue ultimatums. They docked, unloaded, reloaded, and departed, leaving behind nothing but invoices and small, easily overlooked signatures on contracts no one else bothered to read closely. They traded everywhere. Human freighters visited stations that smelled of mold and rust, worlds that had not seen investment in generations, corporate habitats humming with sterile efficiency. They bought minor stakes in refineries that barely mattered, insignificant bonds issued by shipping cooperatives on the verge of collapse, fractional debts so small they registered as rounding errors. Algorithms designed to detect threats slid past these transactions without a flicker of concern. To the galaxy's automated guardians, humanity was background noise. Inside human vessels and offices, patience ruled. Analysts worked in shifts that blurred together, their fingers moving across interfaces with steady rhythm, eyes red from long focus rather than fear. They mapped the movement of fuel from extraction to consumption, of food from marginal agri-worlds to distant arcologies, of spare parts whose absence could strand a ship between stars. Credit flows were traced with equal care, every delay, every rerouting noted and contextualized. Models grew outward not in bursts of urgency, but in slow, deliberate expansions that assumed the future would come and that it would need to be understood. Where other species perceived chaos, humans sensed structure. They had lived with disorder long before the stars, had learned that apparent randomness often concealed systems shaped by habit and necessity. Pirate activity, stripped of its violence, revealed patterns of reliance. Ships needed fuel. Crews needed food. Black markets needed laundering points and insurance backstops. Violence was merely the surface turbulence atop deeper currents of dependency. Humans followed those currents quietly, their work driven not by rage, but by an almost intimate curiosity. To the pirate clans, this behavior appeared comical. Human traders were slow to negotiate, obsessed with clauses and contingencies, endlessly delaying closure in pursuit of clarity. Their representatives smelled of paper and synthetic ink rather than gun oil and ozone. They asked questions that seemed irrelevant, requested documentation that no one else cared to maintain. Pirates marked them as soft, useful only insofar as they paid on time and did not resist. A species unwilling to fight, so the logic went, could never matter. Human crews felt the weight of this perception. On long transits, they slept in narrow bunks that vibrated with engine noise, dreaming of oceans and open skies while the void pressed close beyond thin hull plating. They carried fear like a low-grade radiation, invisible but persistent, mitigated by routine and small comforts. A mug warmed between both hands. A song played quietly through shared speakers. A habit of double-checking seals before rest. They knew what pirates did to those who resisted, and they endured the knowledge without flinching. Yet endurance did not mean surrender. Humanity's strength expressed itself in accumulation rather than confrontation. Each transaction became a thread, each ledger entry a node in a growing web of understanding. Human institutions, decentralized and stubbornly redundant, shared information across light years with methods that favored resilience over speed. Data packets crossed space wrapped in layers of verification and context, designed to survive corruption and neglect. Time, humanity assumed, would always be available, because time had never finished with them yet. In quiet offices carved into asteroids or orbiting dim stars, models began to coalesce. Dependencies revealed themselves not as chains, but as ecosystems, fragile and finely balanced. A single refinery supported dozens of routes. A minor insurer underwrote risk for fleets that pretended independence. A trade guild, hollowed by age and complacency, provided legal shelter for entire pirate economies. None of this was secret. It was simply ignored by those who believed power only spoke loudly. Human analysts felt a strange intimacy with these systems. They came to know the rhythms of distant stations, the seasonal fluctuations of demand, the way fear spiked after a high-profile raid and slowly decayed. They understood that suffering left statistical fingerprints. Entire spreadsheets carried the echo of burned ships and empty colonies, and humans did not look away from those echoes. They absorbed them, translated them into projections, and let them inform decisions made far from any battlefield. To the wider galaxy, humanity remained unremarkable. Their ships continued to trade. Their representatives continued to negotiate. Losses were filed, insurance claimed, and life went on. Pirate clans grew complacent, their confidence reinforced by every unchallenged raid and every clean audit. They believed they had mastered the universe's rules, that legality was a fortress stronger than armor. Humanity believed something else. They believed that systems remembered those who paid attention long enough. In the cold vastness between stars, aboard ships where the hum of engines never quite let one forget how thin survival was, humans chose not to fight the universe as it was. They chose to learn it, piece by piece, trusting that knowledge, patiently applied, could become something far more dangerous than guns. The soft clatter of cooling vents echoed through human archival bays as another data shard slid into place, its surface still warm from transfer. The smell of dust and ozone mingled with the faint bitterness of recycled stimulants, and somewhere deep in the station's spine a reactor pulsed with patient regularity. Outside, stars wheeled in silence, uncaring witnesses to the slow work unfolding beneath their light. Years passed like this, measured not in celebrations or campaigns, but in timestamps, renewals, and quietly closed files. Humanity waited. They waited with fingers stained by ink and eyes dulled by glow, recording every transaction that fed the pirate clans. Every refinery that overproduced by a fraction too consistent to be accidental found itself logged, contextualized, cross-referenced. Every bank that asked no questions because questions slowed profit accumulated a shadow profile, layered with patterns of behavior that only emerged over time. Nothing dramatic marked these efforts. There were no alarms, no declarations, only the steady accumulation of certainty. Each entry felt small, almost trivial, but together they formed a mass that bent attention like gravity. Observers from older powers found this behavior baffling. They still measured strength in fleets assembled and weapons charged, in the visible exertion of dominance. From that perspective, humanity appeared passive, even timid. Their ships continued to trade. Their representatives continued to negotiate. When reports of pirate raids circulated, humans filed the same paperwork as everyone else, claimed the same insurance, mourned their losses in the same quiet corners. Moral outrage, so prized in speeches, seemed absent, replaced by ledgers and audits that carried no emotional resonance for those accustomed to spectacle. Among humans, the waiting carried a different weight. Analysts slept beneath blankets that smelled faintly of machine oil and homeworld fabric, waking to dreams crowded with columns of figures and half-remembered faces. They felt the tension of restraint as a physical ache, a pressure behind the eyes and along the spine. Every instinct shaped by history urged action, resistance, defiance. Instead, they learned to sit with anger without letting it spill, to transmute it into focus. Small rituals helped. A hand resting on the edge of a desk before beginning work. A moment of stillness while watching a loading bar complete. Patience became not just a strategy, but a discipline. Beneath the apparent stasis, pressure accumulated. Contracts matured quietly, their clauses ripening like unseen fruit. Insurance policies reached thresholds that triggered reviews never meant to coincide. Ownership of minor intermediaries shifted through perfectly legal transactions, unnoticed by systems designed to track threats, not subtleties. Supply chains, long optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, grew brittle as their redundancy vanished piece by piece. A shipping cooperative here, a logistics hub there, all changed hands in ways that appeared unremarkable in isolation. The galaxy remained calm, its attention fixed on more immediate dangers. Human hands rewired the switchboard of commerce with deliberate care. Memory mattered more than speed. Files that others archived and forgot were revisited, annotated, and linked to new data as it arrived. The past remained active, informing every projection. Humans understood that systems broke not at points of stress, but at points of assumption. They targeted those assumptions, not with force, but with inevitability. The pirate clans felt none of this. Their stations hummed as they always had, the air thick with confidence and recycled breath. Ledgers balanced. Fuel arrived. Crews were paid. The banners drifted through familiar lanes, unchallenged and secure. When delays occurred, they were attributed to routine inefficiencies, nothing worth concern. The pirates had lived for generations inside the fog of administration, trusting that it would always obscure them. They mistook silence for safety. Across human worlds, life continued with fragile normalcy. Children learned mathematics beneath artificial skies, their lessons flavored by stories of lost ships and hard-won survival. Dock workers developed the small habits that kept them sane, tapping hulls for luck, sharing quiet meals before long shifts, marking time with personal calendars no authority tracked. Humanity's vulnerability remained constant, a thin atmosphere against infinite cold. Yet within that fragility lived an extraordinary capacity for endurance. They had always survived not by overwhelming the universe, but by understanding it more deeply than their adversaries expected. As the years accumulated, patterns sharpened. Dependencies converged. What had once been diffuse networks of mutual convenience tightened into choke points invisible to casual observation. Human models adjusted and readjusted, projecting futures measured in decades rather than quarters. They accounted for panic and denial, for the inertia of institutions and the arrogance of those who believed themselves untouchable. Every scenario assumed restraint until the last possible moment, because restraint preserved options. To outsiders, nothing had changed. Trade flowed. The council debated abstractions. Pirates raided and vanished. The galaxy's vast machinery turned as it always had, grinding down the small and the unlucky. But beneath that motion, something had shifted. The balance was no longer static. The weight of recorded truth pressed against structures built on forgetfulness. Humanity felt the moment approaching not as excitement, but as a deepening stillness. The workrooms grew quieter. Fewer revisions were needed. The model stabilized. There was a collective awareness, unspoken and heavy, that waiting was nearing its end. Fear surfaced alongside resolve, a reminder of how much depended on forces that could not be directly controlled. Yet hope persisted, not bright or triumphant, but steady and grounded in preparation. In the endless dark, where stars burned without regard for justice, humanity chose memory over immediacy. They trusted that time, once aligned, could become an instrument sharper than any blade. The galaxy slept on, unaware that its invisible foundations had been meticulously measured, rebalanced, and prepared for a reckoning that would arrive without fanfare, carried not by warships, but by the quiet certainty of accounts coming due. A soft alarm chimed in a pirate depot that had not heard urgency in years, its tone swallowed by the constant hiss of coolant lines and the stale tang of unfiltered air. Dock lights blinked from green to amber and stayed there, bathing fuel pylons in a sickly glow. Tankers that should have been arriving on tight schedules did not appear, their absence louder than any explosion. The void outside remained perfectly still, stars sharp and indifferent, while inside the machinery of certainty began to stutter. The collapse arrived without fire. On a single cycle, accounts that had always cleared simply did not. Ledgers refreshed and returned the same empty confirmations, cold and final. Compliance flags rose like silent sentinels, their logic embedded too deeply for any captain to override. Fuel shipments diverted themselves along lawful corridors, rerouted by clauses buried so far down the contractual stack that no pirate had ever bothered to read them. The smell of desperation crept into corridors once scented with confidence, a mix of overheated circuitry and unwashed fear. Crews felt it first in small, intimate ways. Wage transfers stalled, then froze, leaving personal balances hollow and unresponsive. Families on distant stations discovered their lines of credit severed, access denied by systems that had always answered yes. Black market suppliers, long accustomed to discretion, began insisting on lawful payment, their risk models abruptly intolerant of exposure. The universe did not accuse or threaten. It simply enforced. Allies vanished before enemies could react, not through betrayal, but through insolvency. Shipping partners failed audits and disappeared into receivership. Fixers stopped answering because their offices had been seized. Safe harbors closed as station authorities, suddenly empowered by clarity, followed procedures they had ignored for generations. Across multiple systems, human-held debts were called in at once, synchronized by calendars no pirate had known existed. The effect rippled outward, a pressure wave felt not in space, but in access. Ships drifted. They did not explode or fall to gunfire. They drifted powerless between stars, engines starved of fuel, crews conserving heat and breath. Hulls creaked softly as temperature gradients shifted, metal contracting against vacuum. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint hum of life support struggling to justify its own existence. These vessels had once moved with purpose, banners fluttering in simulated gravity. Now they became debris in slow motion, intact but abandoned by the invisible scaffolding that had sustained them. The pirate clans struggled to understand what was happening. Their instincts reached for weapons and intimidation, but there were no targets. No fleets massed against them. No ultimata arrived. The systems they attacked were administrative, procedural, uncaring. Attempts to reroute funds triggered further locks. Emergency loans failed to materialize as lenders enforced terms written generations earlier. The pirates discovered, too late, that their freedom had always been conditional. Across the galaxy, human offices felt the shift like a change in air pressure. Analysts watched confirmations scroll in, their screens glowing softly in darkened rooms. There was no celebration, only a tightening in the chest, an awareness of the scale of what had been set in motion. Many paused, hands hovering above interfaces, feeling the accumulated weight of years of restraint. They thought of ships that had burned, of names recorded and never forgotten, of long nights fueled by bitterness turned into focus. The work had reached its irreversible phase. Human traders continued their routines with careful normalcy. Freighters docked and departed. Cargo moved along lawful routes. Where disruptions occurred, contingency plans activated smoothly, built into models that assumed turbulence. Humanity absorbed the shock they had released, cushioning allies and stabilizing routes that would otherwise have collapsed. This was not vengeance as spectacle. It was correction as process. The pirate clans learned the truth of their position in stages. First came denial, then frantic attempts to reassert control through familiar channels. When those failed, understanding arrived with a physical heaviness. They had never been independent. They had been tolerated. Their existence had depended on a vast network of quiet accommodations, on insurers willing to look away, on banks eager to profit without inquiry, on authorities content to outsource pain. That tolerance had an expiration date, and it had been reached without warning bells or heroic stands. Stations that once thrummed with illicit commerce grew cold. Lights dimmed as power budgets tightened. The smell of rust returned to corridors scrubbed clean for years. Crews scattered, some surrendering to local law, others attempting to vanish into a galaxy suddenly hostile to invisibility. The banners that had drifted unchallenged were lowered, their symbols stripped of meaning in the face of foreclosure notices and asset seizures. For the wider galaxy, the event registered as an anomaly in trade flows, a brief period of disruption followed by unexpected stability. Lanes reopened. Insurance premiums recalibrated downward. Colonies that had rationed for generations found shipments arriving on time. The absence of violence unsettled observers more than war would have. No one could point to a decisive battle or a conquering fleet. The change felt like waking to find gravity subtly altered. Humanity bore the emotional cost quietly. There was relief, yes, but also grief for what had been necessary. They understood that this victory did not erase suffering. It acknowledged it. In small human ways, they marked the moment. A cup of bitter coffee set aside and forgotten as an analyst stared at a stabilized graph. A maintenance worker pausing to touch a hull that would now travel safer routes. A parent sending a message home, knowing that fewer names would be added to the list kept in drawers and hearts. In the infinite cold, where stars burned on without conscience, humanity demonstrated a truth the galaxy had long denied. Power did not always arrive in fire. Sometimes it arrived as an invoice honored, a contract enforced, a system made to remember its own rules. The pirate clans had believed themselves untouchable because they had mastered chaos. Humanity answered by mastering memory. As ships drifted back into lawful motion and stations breathed easier air, the lesson spread without proclamation. The universe might reward caution, but it could be reshaped by patience. And patience, wielded by a species that had learned to survive by enduring, could end empires without ever lighting the sky. The sound of cargo clamps locking echoed through reopened trade ports, a deep metallic thud that resonated through decks long accustomed to silence. Fresh air cycled through stations that had smelled of neglect for generations, carrying hints of coolant, clean metal, and the faint sweetness of renewed power flow. Navigation beacons pulsed steady and confident, their light cutting through the dark with unfamiliar certainty. The galaxy moved again, and in that movement lay confusion as profound as any shockwave. In the aftermath, no one could quite explain what had happened. Observers searched for the familiar signatures of conquest and found none. No armadas had darkened the stars. No planets bore scars of orbital fire. Archives recorded no heroic last stands, no fleets annihilated in spectacular arcs of flame. Instead, the pirate clans dissolved quietly, their power unraveling through paperwork and procedure. Lawsuits replaced firefights. Asset seizures supplanted bombardments. Quiet arrests unfolded in dockside offices and residential corridors, carried out by local authorities who suddenly found clarity where there had once been fog. That clarity felt almost physical. Officials moved through processes with newfound confidence, their steps lighter, their breathing steadier. Jurisdictional maps, once tangled beyond use, aligned into coherent structures. Warrants executed themselves through systems that had always existed but never quite connected. The pirates did not scream defiance into the void. They faded, absorbed by the mechanisms they had exploited for so long. The galaxy watched, unsettled by how little noise the end of an era produced. Trade lanes reopened not under threat, but under assurance. Convoys returned to routes abandoned in fear, their engines humming with cautious optimism. Insurance models recalibrated, premiums easing as predictability returned. Colonies that had learned to ration light and warmth felt their environments brighten, the hum of machinery steady instead of strained. Stability arrived not as an edict, but as a condition, engineered through balance rather than imposed through terror. Humanity claimed nothing. No flags were planted. No declarations of victory broadcast across the stars. Their ships continued to dock and depart with the same unassuming regularity, hulls bearing the marks of long service rather than triumph. Credit lines were restored methodically, flowing back into systems that had been drained by predation. Supply chains were restructured with care, redundancy rebuilt where efficiency had once stripped resilience away. The work was meticulous, almost intimate, guided by an understanding of how fragile life remained against the vastness beyond hull and shield. Data followed. Humanity published everything. The ledgers, the models, the dependencies mapped over patient years were open to scrutiny. Other species studied them with a mixture of awe and unease, tracing the quiet logic that had undone what fleets could not. There was generosity in this transparency, but also a warning. The systems that govern the galaxy were no longer abstract. They were knowable, and therefore accountable. In human habitats, the victory registered in small ways. A maintenance crew noticed fewer emergency calls during a shift. A child slept through the cycle without alarms interrupting dreams. Analysts closed files they had carried for most of their careers, the finality bringing an unexpected ache. Many felt the weight of what had been endured to reach this point, the restraint that had demanded as much courage as open battle. There was pride, but it was subdued, tempered by memory. The council convened amid quieter chambers, their ancient senses attuned to a shift they struggled to categorize. They had believed violence the only universal language, the sole means by which the universe resolved imbalance. Humanity's answer unsettled that belief. Accounting, patience, and an unyielding memory had proven sufficient to reshape the galaxy's moral landscape. Power, it seemed, could be exercised through care as much as force, through endurance rather than dominance. Across the stars, species adjusted their understanding of humanity. They saw a people small against the infinite, bound to fragile atmospheres and vulnerable bodies, yet capable of influencing systems far larger than themselves. Humans did not deny their fear or their pain. They carried both openly, folding them into resolve. They remembered losses not as fuel for rage, but as data points demanding a better future. The pirate banners vanished from common sight, their absence gradually accepted as normal. New generations grew up without learning to fear certain routes or dim certain lights. The galaxy breathed easier, though it never forgot how close it had come to mistaking inevitability for necessity. In quiet corners of space, historians began to frame the event not as a war won, but as a catastrophe prevented. For humanity, the lesson lingered long after the ledgers closed. They understood that time itself had been their greatest ally. By aligning patience, memory, and action, they had turned inevitability on its head. Some species fought with guns. Others fought with laws. Humanity had fought with time, stretching moments into years, years into leverage, and leverage into change. Time, once aligned against you, never missed. Humanity knew this because they had lived under its weight for as long as they could remember. In the endless dark, where stars burned indifferent and vast, they had learned not to outshine the universe, but to endure it, to understand it, and when necessary, to quietly, inexorably, reshape it.